The 2025 draft almost looked vastly different for the Houston Texans. Nick Caserio tried to make a big trade. What was he trying to make that trade for? Let's break it down. Presented by my friends at The Perfect Gene. It was not a perfect trade offer from Nick Caserio, but get yourself a perfect pair of jeans from The Perfect Gene. Get 15% off and free shipping when you use my link in the description down below. So this week we found out that Houston Texans targeted the 38th overall pick in a trade with the New England Patriots. And we found that out by the New England Patriots behind the scenes look at the rebuilding of their franchise. It's called Forged in Foxborough. And as you see here, a screenshot from it, the Texans were talking with the Patriots when the Patriots were on the clock with the 38th overall pick. And the Houston Texans were trying to move up from 58 to get to 38. What exactly were the Texans looking to get? Well, let's take a look at the trade that would have added to the talent density for the Houston Texans, but my goodness, it would have gutted the rest of that draft for the Texans. The trade offer that the Texans had on the table with the New England Patriots when they were 38th overall on the clock was the 58th overall pick, which the Texans ultimately ended up trading. Anyway, the 79th overall pick, which the Texans used on Jalen Noel, stuck and pick at 79 is what they ended up doing, and a future third-round selection, so a 2026 third-round selection. Of course, the Texans ended up trading a future third-round selection later in the draft. They were trying to get up to 38th overall. Now, looking at the value of this trade, this was potentially a massive overpay for the Houston Texans. This would have been yet another Nick Caserio more than sticker price pay in a trade. And it would have cost the Texans a future third-round pick. It would have been a big draft blunder by Nick Caserio. Regardless of what they ended up doing with the picks, it would have been basically a value of a third-round pick overpay in this trade, according to the way most people evaluate and analyze draft trade charts. So it would have been a very bad move from a value standpoint by Nick Caserio. But Caserio, in his past, has not been shy about leaking value in a trade if he gets the player that he wants. Now, who is that player? Who were the Texans trying to go up to 38th overall to get after they'd already selected Jaden Higgins at 34th overall? Well, the first question or the first answer is naturally who the New England Patriots ultimately ended up selecting and who they felt like they couldn't take the trade because they liked that player so much, and that's Ohio State running back TreVeyon Henderson. Now, if the Houston Texans had left day 2 of the NFL draft with Jaden Higgins, TreVeyon Henderson, the running back from Ohio State, and let's say another player that they drafted in the third round. Because remember, the Texans would have still had the 89th overall pick and the 99th overall pick after this trade, and maybe they move around a little bit to go and get one more player instead of picking 2. So if they'd left with Jaden Higgins and TreVeyon Henderson, let's call it one more player for the Texans, I'd have a hard time saying that was a bad day, but knowing how it ultimately played out, we have the ability to play hindsight, and it is 2020. It feels like the Texans would have been more talent dense. TreVeyon Henderson's a fantastic player. I really liked him. He was my second favorite running back that could have been available for the Houston Texans behind Omarion Hampton, who ultimately never got close to getting to the Texans. But TreVeyon Henderson would have been a fantastic addition to Jaden Higgins. He's the perfect complement to what Joe Mixon is right now, and he could have been a home run hitter for the Houston Texans whenever he touches the ball, spelling Joe Mixon or playing for Joe Mixon in a couple of third down situations. I would have liked that a lot. I just feel like maybe the volume that they ultimately ended up with is probably a little bit better. And could they have still gotten an offensive lineman at some point with those extra third-round picks that they did have? TreVeyon Henderson, maybe a potential target. I got to thinking, looking at some of the players that went right around there, I don't believe it would have been Missouri wide receiver Luther Burden at 38th overall for the Houston Texans. They passed him up at 34th overall, and I feel like they only added 2 wide receiver because Noel was such a good value according to their board when they ultimately picked at 79th. But how about TJ Sanders, the defensive tackle from South Carolina? He's a player that went a few picks after 38th. Maybe the Texans were looking to round out that defensive tackle room with the big fella from South Carolina. Man, Sanders was an impressive player for the Gamecocks, but I would have hated this trade even more if they'd been moving up that far to go and get a defensive tackle. They had options at defensive tackle, and I don't know that Sanders or Alfred Collins, another defensive tackle who went a few picks after Sanders, I don't know that either of those players would have been worthwhile investments for the Houston Texans in that trade up. It would have been pretty lackluster to go up and get a defensive tackle at that 38th overall spot, especially in what was widely considered a pretty deep defensive tackle class. And ultimately, the Texans didn't get one until late in the draft, opting for some other positions. If you want to opt for the best jeans around, the Perfect Jean has those for you. They're the most comfortable jeans that I've ever worn. It's hard to find jeans that you can survive in when it gets hot outside, but the Perfect jeans are incredible. They are lightweight, they are stretchy, and they are super breathable. I was outside a bunch on Saturday. It was hot. On Saturday, I was wearing my black pair of jeans from the Perfect Jean, and I didn't totally sweat my balls off, okay? That's the big thing. You're still going to sweat. You're wearing pants in summer in Houston. You're going to sweat, but the breathability far better than any pair of jeans that I've ever worn. 15% off, free shipping, free exchanges when you visit my link in the description down below at the Perfect Jean. Get yourself a perfect pair of jeans from the Perfect Jean. So maybe the trade up to 38th overall wasn't for Travion Henderson, the running back from Ohio State. Maybe it wasn't for either of those defensive tackles. Maybe it was simply just guaranteeing that they get Ariante Ursary, the offensive tackle from Minnesota, who the Texans ultimately traded up for in a much more understandable trade later on. They traded the 99th overall pick to move up from 58 to 48 and got themselves Ariante Ursary in what was a much better valued trade for the Houston Texans. So maybe getting all the way up to 38 was about getting Ariante Ursary. Now, I would have hated that more than the defensive tackles because at least I could see a clear path to how the defensive tackles get on the field in 2025. We still don't have that for Ursary here in 2025. He's going to have to beat somebody out or an injury is going to have to give him that opportunity. So I would have hated the move up for Ursary. And I think ultimately where I land on all this is I probably would have hated this move even if it was for Travion Henderson. I wouldn't have loved this from Nick Caserio. It would have been a massive overpay, which I don't love. It's okay to leak a little bit of value here and there in a trade, but leaking essentially a third-round pick's worth of value, even though you're trying to, with a crowbar, pry the Patriots off of that pick, I don't love that from the Houston Texans. So I wouldn't have loved that trade, even though I love Travion Henderson, and he would have been a fantastic complement to what the Texans have at the running back spot and in the running back room. And the Texans still would have had two selections in the third round, and I assume they maybe would have moved around a little bit to try to find somebody. So it would have been a more talent-dense draft instead of a depth-centric draft, ultimately what the Texans had, because they've got depth at wide receiver coming out of that, ultimately what they did draft. They got depth at offensive tackle. They got depth in the secondary. So it probably changes drastically what they end up with, and obviously we know what the draft class is. We don't know exactly what the Texans were doing at 38th overall, but good job by the Texans to try to be aggressive, especially after day one didn't go the way they wanted with trade-ups, but that would have been a big-time blunder by Nick Caserio. So that blunder avoided because the Patriots ultimately say thanks, but no thanks, and then Caserio maneuvered around pretty well to get Ariante Ursary, and I love the Jalen Noel selection. It's hard for me to go through other draft scenarios when you think about the fact that they ended up with Jaden Higgins and Jalen Noel, two of my favorite wide receivers in this draft. And Noel brings an incredible speed element to the team, which is something similar that Travion Henderson would have brought, but it's easier to put Noel on the field a bunch right away than it would be to put Henderson on the field right away a bunch. So ultimately, thumbs up with how they got the draft to eventually play out in their favor. Thumbs down on the near deal that they made with the New England Patriots. What say you? Would you have liked that trade up from 58 to 38 and all the extra value that you would have had to give away to go and get that pick? And who would you have liked to see the Texans pick at 38? I think I'm leaning towards Travion Henderson. I'd have been okay with that, but I like the draft that they had a little bit more than what they did in the imaginary world where they got that 38th overall pick. Let me know in the comment section down below. On your way down there, thumbs up the video. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Check out SNL with myself, Landry Locker from the Locker Room, weekdays, 4 p.m. You don't want to miss out on that. Of course, don't forget to visit my friends at The Perfect Gene. 15% off, free shipping, free exchanges, tons of colors, tons of different styles from the athletic fit, which is what I wear, to boot cut, to slim fit, to slim thick fit, because maybe you like the slim cut, but you still got a little bit of junk in the trunk. You got something for everybody, tons of colors, tons of different options for you at The Perfect Gene. 15% off your first order and free shipping and free exchanges. If you get something you don't like it's easy to exchange, my friends at The Perfect Gene. Appreciate you watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed what the Texans ultimately did and aren't lamenting the fact that they didn't get potentially Travion Henderson. And I can't wait till we talk Texans again soon.